President Trump. Are you looking to buy or lease today?
Well, I'm going to buy, and I'm going to buy because, number one, it's a great product, as good as it gets, and number two, because this man has devoted his energy and his life to doing this. I think he's been treated very unfairly by a very small group of people. And I just want people to know that you can't be penalized for being a patriot. And he's a great patriot. And he's also done an incredible job with Tesla. And I mean, nobody else has a car company started up in the last 30 years that's been successful. I don't think so. And not only successful, but super successful. And because he's able to find billions and billions and billions of dollars of fraud and waste and all of the things. I mean, our country is going to be very strong very soon because of a lot of the things that he's done and a lot of the things that I'm doing. And there's no better team, but there's no better for what we're doing. There's nobody like this, and he shouldn't be penalized. And when I watched the other day, I said, I can't believe it. It should be the opposite. People should be going wild, and they love the product, but because he's finding all sorts of terrible things that have taken place against our country, they want to penalize him in an economic sense. And I just think that's very unfair. So I just wanted to make a statement. I'm going to buy one. Now, here's the bad news. I'm not allowed to drive because I haven't driven a car in a long time, and I love to drive cars. But I'm going to have it at the White House, and I'm going to let my staff use it. I'm going to let people at the place use it. And they all are all excited about that. I'm not allowed to use it. Can you believe it? One of my great things in life is that I can, I like to drive cars, but I'm not allowed to.
One of my great things in life is I love to drive cars, but I'm not allowed to. There is our fearless commander, Donald Trump. I would just say BYD, the Chinese car company that is basically cleaning Tesla's clock right now, was founded in 1994. So just about 30 years, so close to that cutoff there. But I would say maybe that's a better car company than Elon Musk, which is having trouble lately.
When it comes to Tesla, you got to put your thumb on the scale just a little bit.
And luckily yesterday, and the day before, it had dipped the stock price of Tesla below its 6-month starting point 6 months ago. Now it's back up if you bought 6 months ago, just slightly, thanks to what was basically a Toyotathon for Elon Musk in the Rose Garden. And just before we get,
they don't advertise. Tesla doesn't advertise, Matt.
Oh yeah, no. That's funny. Yeah, well, you just buy it at the White House. And so Trump had a pretty interesting day today. Here's a little bit more how Fox News covered this. I mean, Fox News going to the White House for this.
I bought for a very special young woman. Do you know? I'm sure you've never heard of her, Kai. And she's a great golfer, and she puts the clubs in the back, and I guess it's a very safe deal. She loves it. And I actually bought one about a year ago, and she loves it. And it's very safe, it's very strong, heavy. It's all steel, stainless steel. But the cars themselves, what is this one, Elon?
That's the Model Y.
That's a Model Y, so I have a lot of information to put into price.
Yeah.
I want to make a good deal here. I do notice this. They have one, which is $35,000, which is pretty low. What is that all about?
Yeah, I guess we want to make the point that Teslas aren't all.
What a great salesman Elon is.
Well, that's why he's a genius. I mean, I think that's one of the funnier things that we've been getting about Musk is that every time he sort of fumbles around speaking, there is a cohort of Americans. It's like, that is how those smart guys talk. They can't complete a sentence.
It's because he's thinking of so much stuff. Here is what Trump was holding there, and this is just like in the sort of time capsule for a shabby descent into just commercialist garbage that we're seeing in this country right now. Tesla price in full self-driving Model X, $112,000 all the way down to the Model Y. The full self-driving thing is also interesting because there's been some issues. I think an early cause for the Tesla stock price to fall beyond this was a Chinese company, I believe it might have been BYD, announcing that we're not going to do the whole thing where we do microtransactions to give you the feature set of like self-driving and stuff like that. That's just going to be part of our cars, like air
great.
conditioning.
Yeah.
Which goes at a core business model of Elon's, as you can see there. And then
I can't believe I didn't pay for my AC subscription service this month, and I have to sit in my 100-degree car until next month.
And you forgot to pay for the self-driving bill. And all of a sudden you just careen right off
the. Well, that might happen if you do pay the bill, to be fair, but
yeah, exactly. Brandon Sutton tweeted this out, pretty bad lefty on Twitter. This is Trump in the car, and Brandon points out, okay, but he legit looks like he was just blowing him in this photo. And Mr. Chavez, this is look like the shot of signing, the shot in The Shining, which is exactly how I thought, right? Like that image there, and it's just funny to mention that because the last little note in this, which has happened not even a year ago, on July 16th, 2024, Donald Trump had Elon Musk. Well, he had him on earlier, and he tweeted this out.
Yeah.
When Elon Musk came to the White House asking me for help on all of his many subsidized projects, whether it's electric cars that don't drive long enough, driverless cars that crash, or rocket ships nowhere. I mean, you see why he's a good campaigner. Without which subsidies he'd be worthless, and telling me how he was a big Trump fan Republican, I could have said, drop to your knees and beg, and he would have done it.
I mean, I'll tell you, Musk is screwing up in many ways, but I think specifically like by tying himself so closely to Trump, I mean, he's really screwing these businesses over. I mean, like the fact of the matter is like around Trump, there's always grifters, right? This is like Trump Inc. in many ways, right? And like Trump, Musk is somebody who has been able to make a lot of money off of like public perception of him as like a super genius. But again, like that public perception is that like he is a super genius who's going to like save us from climate change or whatever. And the thing that you buy is like an expensive vehicle from him or getting the government to give him money. Now he might have some access to that with Trump right now. But as we're seeing with like, with the Tesla stuff, the people who buy Teslas are not the same people who buy Trump commemorative coins or My Pillow, right? And Musk should have paid a little bit more attention to the guys who are trying to like make money off of their Trump connections, so that he didn't find himself in the situation. Because I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a bump for a little while, but this isn't something that'll be able to last you throughout the season.
Sorry, did you see Crystal Ball's take on the dealerships? It's probably too close to play it all, but basically that 8,600 Teslas were sold in one weekend in Canada at 4 dealerships, just in time to drain money from an electric vehicle rebate fund. It would come down to like selling 2 Teslas a minute all of a sudden, just out of nowhere. It's like when you're doing like a Kickstarter and you're not going to meet your goal, so you have one of your rich friends just like top it up with his credit card.
Or how conservatives end up on the bestseller list, right? They just buy their own book.
Exactly. It's great to have this much money able to just play around with people's perceptions of like things like prices.
Yeah, look, and the fact of the matter is like there is a lot of money in like right-wing grifts and like the right-wing world, but it's not like billionaire money, right? It's not like being the richest man in the world money, and it's kind of fumble the bag. I think like Musk is to maybe become like a B-list right-wing celebrity. Might have been a little short-sighted, but who knows? I could be wrong. We've thought this guy's been done many times in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it ends horribly for him. I think we can all agree on that.
Sure do. Well, folks, we got an excellent show for everybody. We'll be talking in just a couple minutes to Carl Baer about Ukraine. Really always wonderful talking with him. People should go and subscribe to his work. We have the links below. We also spoke with Tarence Ray from the Trillbillies, which was a lot of fun, something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. He wrote an excellent piece in The Nation I highly suggest people read that as well. There's a link to it as well. And we get into this kind of like red state mythology, particularly the entire conception of red versus blue states, how recent of a phenomenon that is, how that might be bad for thinking about politics. We talk about what some of us call like the rural whisperer, these kind of figures who pop up on cable news every once in a while to tell you what the folks in the sticks really believe. It's always really great to be able to have those conversations. And Trillbillies obviously tremendous, and it was really great having a friend on to talk about all those issues here.
Yeah, it's a conversation we've been talking about having with Terence for, I mean, as long as this has been a show. But it's nice that, I mean, him actually doing that really great and substantial piece in the nation, as great a time as any to have it.
Yeah. Well, before we get over there, Matt, I just want to talk for just a couple minutes. I mean, could you just give us we talked about it a little bit with Carl, but could you just give us a kind of lay of the land about where things are with this Columbia free speech case?
Yeah, Mahmoud Khalil, who was the protesters' sort of liaison with the administration, giving their straightforward demands for divesting and transparency about investment decisions regarding apartheid states, which is just follows in this straight line from the anti-apartheid protests of South Africa 35 or so years ago. Where it stands now is I believe there's a hearing tomorrow and a bunch of protests. So check your local DSA or Justice for Palestine branches, because there's going to be a lot of, I believe at 11 a.m. I've seen one in New York here, but also in St. Louis, and I'm sure other places um, for Khalil. And right now it stands, I believe he's still in Louisiana. He
And the hope there was to get him into a jurisdiction that would probably be more friendly to Trump, correct? I mean, there's just no doubt about it that like this is the, and people should just like note that for a second though. Like this is the authorities purposefully moving people so that they can get favorable rulings, right? Which is already an admission that they think that they could be seen as doing something illegal or wrong.
Yeah, these detention centers were noted for abuses prior to this too. I don't know if that was ProPublica or who was it. I can't find that off the top of my head. But yeah, South Louisiana it's awful stuff, and they're subjected to it for political reasons. A group of, I believe, 14 or so Democrats signed a letter calling for his release. AOC was not one of those, which was disappointing to everyone immediately. Mike Casca, who's sort of her inside guy, said she would have. She was waiting on a detail, but she would have signed it. They just, published it, which is okay, fine. I was impressed to see Jasmine Crockett's name on that, because I had been concerned about certain votes and stances she's taken on Israel Palestine. So it was nice to see, but only 14 out of 535 or however many Democrats is a grim situation. Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, leader of the Democrats in the Senate and the House, have released statements which sort of accept the premise that there's possible anti-Semitism here that is just ludicrous. And their position is that the Columbia administration can be trusted on dealing with that, and we don't need to get the law involved, which is, I think, not helpful at all. So I think that's where we stand at the moment now.
And just to note, I haven't kept up with everyone who signed the letter, but I know AOC individually released a statement, as did Greg Kassar and others. But right, I think that's true. It's worth noting. And look, I mean, we're going to have a lot more to talk about. I mean, I just want to make a quick warning to folks. It's something I've been talking to Matt about and to other friends, which is that y'all, like people, we as a movement and people listening to this program, people in this country really need, one, to be vigilant, to be engaged in all the ways that Matt was laying out. But I don't want to come off as alarmist. People who've been watching me for years know that I'm not one of these people who starts screaming and yelling and running every time the right does something bad. Right? It makes me mad. It upsets me. I say we need to organize. But we are in a moment right now where there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens in the near to immediate future. And I think it's going to be very critical that people take very seriously engaging in and understanding the reasons why we defend certain kind of principles, right? Basic things, like why we think that everybody in the country has a right to a lawyer, right? Why we believe in concepts like asylum, privacy, freedom of speech, obviously, and not just okay. There's a checklist of things that I believe in as values, but why do you believe them? How can you make an argument about why these kind of things are important? Because what the right does, and what they have been very effective at doing with their media apparatus. And I'm sure everybody's seen, the Sam Cedar debate video that came out over the weekend. But you saw a very shocking lack of consideration and experience from the people that he was debating with certain functions of our government, with certain kind of principles of democracy. And I'm not even at this point like trying to shame folks. I'm trying to say there is an apparatus right now out there that is trying to use, yes, misinformation, but also like immediacy, right? So when you look at the ways that like kind of basic human rights, basic civil rights, basic political rights get taken away from folks, it's always like an egregious case, right? This one obviously is being painted as somebody who's engaged in terrorism or anti-Semitism, right? And we all know that's a lie, but there's a lot of people who are like, oh, that is a bad thing, and maybe we should, we can limit those kind of rights to freedom of speech and those kind of protections that we have in this country in this case, right? But you can imagine other examples that will be trotted out to try to see how far can we push this country? How many rights can we take away from folks? So there is a value in understanding and being capable of defending rights like freedom of speech, rights like the right to a lawyer in all circumstances, right? So that we can push back against these moments, both as like a political movement, but in those kind of day-to-day conversations that are going to happen as I think the right engages in the work of trying to pull those rights away. So that's just, I'm sure you
Yeah.
have some thoughts there, but that's just a warning. It's something that's been on my head. Like people should go and read and engage with the foundational arguments for these positions, so that you can articulate them yourselves, because it will be on all of us to do that work.
Yeah, and I think Ryan Grimm's been doing a little of this too, pointing out like, like Vietnam, you could say I support the Viet Cong. If you were like,
Mhm.
helping supply them weapons or something, you might have got done for it. But for the speech issue is very clear. It's not terrorism to say even I like X terrorist group. That's
Mhm.
free speech, and yeah, it's kind of alarming. The degree to which, especially the terrorism. I mean, terrorism everywhere. I didn't even mention it up top. The other thing Trump mentioned, and on top of how cheap and affordable the Model Y is that attacking a Tesla dealership, which I don't know if that includes like if you throw
Yeah.
an egg at it, is terrorism.
Mhm.
So yeah,
And again, as we talked about, like I, I don't even want to get distracted with it, but the fact of the matter is that vandalism. There are statutes and rules about that kind of thing, right? Getting these up to terrorism charges is an attempt to pull back basic civil protections, the presumption of innocence, all these kind of things from people as a political favor, to not only an ally of Trump, but one of the wealthiest people in the world, right? As somebody who lives in a democracy, though, that kind of talk should worry you, and it should worry you beyond just being like, I don't support the Republican Party or I don't support Trump. It should worry you that we have allowed like the revolutionary history of America, right, to degrade so much that people just sort of don't even bat an eye when you see somebody in a position like Trump, talking about basically eradicating the entire American legal system and the protections for individuals from overzealous punishments from the government. And before we get all these kind of chirping from folks like, well, America was never like this or America was never like that. The fact of the matter is that, yes, all of these things sort of exist in a spectrum, right? And American history is a messy affair. Absolutely. But most people recognize why these kind of ideals are important to them, right? These are the kind of things that you have to appeal to in America. And I'm not just talking about out of expediency, because there is a democratic spirit in our history and in our culture, right? That I think is true and is motivating and is mobilizing for folks and is a good thing to appeal to. I want to be able to appeal to the democratic spirit of people in this country, right? And people should engage in that kind of work. And leftists don't realize how much harm you do when you say, basically agree with the right and say, yeah, you know what, everything is cynical, right? And there is no real importance of these kind of protections because this event happened or that event happened. I'm not talking about having an ahistorical view of America or a non-materialist view of America, but when you can engage in these kind of arguments or appeals because you want to sort of like talk about other events in history, you do yourself a disservice. More importantly, you do the movement a disservice.
Yeah, and just one update here is a thread from Aaron Richlin Melnick, a grim thread, I'll say. So Matt Iglesias says, claim from White House to the Free Press is specifically that Khalil was not breaking the law and that this is intended blueprint for future action. Quote, the allegation here is not that he was breaking the law, it's that he's a threat to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. Aaron Richlin Melnick cites, who's an immigration sort of expert, cites the law saying it authorizes the Secretary of State to personally declare any non-citizen deportable solely by asserting that person's presence in the United States would, quote, would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. So that's the actual law. And I'll just go here. Crucially, any First Amendment challenge to the law under which the government is seeking to deport him generally cannot be made at the administrative agency stage. So it may be years before those arguments get heard by a federal court. So horrible.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. And this should be the thing that people are keeping up with and paying attention to, because it is that kind of critical fight. And we're seeing a lot of things being pushed to the brink. So, buck up, get serious, and, stay tuned here. We'll go over to Carl. The conversation we have with Carl will be very interesting. We talk a bit about this as also Ukraine, and then stick around for a conversation about how the red state was invented. You won't want to miss a second of it. Support us at patreon.com/leftreckoning and enjoy the rest of the show, friends.
See you folks. Welcome, Left Reckoners. With me as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, friend.
And joining us once again, Carl Beijer, who is a proprietor of carlbeijer.com. A couple times guest of this program, not for a while though, and I wanted to pick his brain about a number of his blogs because I mean, even going back to Bernie 2015, Carl's been somebody whose blog I've looked to for a lot of very smart, succinct points on things. But Carl, I'm sort of distracted by the Mahmoud Khalil disappearance. So DHS detained a lead negotiator of Colombia Gaza Solidarity Encampment, Mahmoud Khalil, who was detained on Saturday. I went to bed last night not knowing where he was still on Sunday. We're recording this on Monday. And then now it turns out he's in Louisiana. I'm just curious your immediate response to that.
Well, on one hand, it's scary, right? And I'm not sure that everybody understood that this kind of thing was in the cards with Trump coming. Even people who are very pessimistic about Trump, I never heard anybody talking about them spiriting away Palestinian protesters. But, I guess like for me, on one hand, it's scary and my heart goes out to him and his family and all of that. And on the other, I guess the way I think about this is we're talking about free speech again, instead of Palestine. I wrote a piece a while back called "Don't Let Them Make Israel-Palestine a Free Speech Issue." And the reason that I said that is that we end up spending so much time talking about whether we have the right to speak in defense of Palestine that sometimes we don't get around to speaking in defense of Palestine. And, that's our priority. That has to be our priority above everything at this point. And so, on one hand, I come into this with a lot of understanding because it's such a dramatic and such a terrible thing. And on the other hand, I guess I just worry a bit about, what this is doing to a pro-Palestinian discourse that has already been a little bit pacified since Biden left office, largely because of the ceasefire talks, which, are dubious as it is, but that's part of the point of it, is to sort of relieve the pressure on the administration, and it did its job. Also, just because, people were out of school for a while, and whenever people are out of school, the protest movement dies down and then it picks back up afterwards. That I haven't really seen much talk about that in the press when people are talking about what happened with the Palestine movement over the last couple of months. But that's actually, like, if you look at how university officials think about it and talk about it, they're all like, yeah, okay, let's just hold out and this will go away during winter break, or this will go away during summer break. It's just a known thing that protest movements, university-based protest movements, die down over breaks. And you always have to hope that they come back. But in this case, it seems like, especially in New York, it's come back quite a bit, less so elsewhere. I guess one more point I will add is this does, it's so obvious that I almost don't want to say it, but this does hammer home the point that this free speech deal we have, where we're supposed to defend their free speech and they're supposed to defend our free speech, and we have this reciprocal agreement supposedly in place that keeps anybody from being censored. That's obviously just a complete myth. That's clearly not what's happening. They have no interest, the administration has no interest on protecting our speech on a whole lot of grounds, and they never did. And it's absolute madness to proceed as if, I've seen people say, well, if the left didn't want this to happen, they shouldn't have been canceling people and censoring people with all the wokeness and stuff like that. They would have been doing this anyway. So, if free speech is very important to you as a matter of principle, then I say fine, defend it in principle, but don't defend it with the belief that doing so is going to prevent other people from censoring you, because that's just not the way it works.
On your first point, it does. I have been a little bit worried about all the emphasis of, he's got a pregnant wife, which is a hugely tragic component of the story, and I feel so badly for her. But even if he didn't, right? Like, the offense is still like, and ultimately, what he's saying and what the protesters were demanding, which is just divestment of Colombia's investments from an apartheid state. And instead, we're calling it material support for terrorism. We've gone absolutely through the looking glass, and it's also like, this is the immigration side of it too. This is an issue. This is a scandal that encapsulates a number of different really hot button issues right now.
I've been worried about, in particular, that point you made about how they are spinning divestment as material support. I would encourage people to just be very careful about who you're donating to right now. I don't want to discourage donations by any means, but you do have to do it bearing in mind that we have an administration that's going to try to spin what you're doing as material support for terrorism. And so you got to look for, the most legitimate venues that you can find, or the cleanest ones. And I'm no expert on, charitable giving in Palestine, so I don't know who to go through, but it's something that I could really see becoming a pretext for arrests and for all kinds of legal harassment.
On this issue, I think it's one of the more frightening things that we've seen in a long while, just in terms of like the escalation of what's going on. I mean, talking about material support for terrorist organizations, and if you look at some of the clips of what the student had been saying that are trying to be painted in some kind of incendiary way, it's truly bizarre. But I'm curious, Carl, if you could kind of speak a little bit about this. I don't know, like the partisan nature of it, right? Because as you're saying, it's like, everyone's sort of saying things like, oh, the left had done this or whatever. But, the left was never really in a position of power. And the fact of the matter is, like, this is happening in blue New York, right?
Mm-hmm. And what was, I think Chuck Schumer maybe made a I forget who it was. Somebody made a statement about him today or tweeted something out about him. Maybe it wasn't Schumer. But in any case, Democrats have been very complicit in this, in the way that they have, from the very beginning of these protests, they've sort of painted them as something dangerous and possibly illegal, and talking, sort of shining a floodlight on any kind of little incident that might have happened, blowing things out of proportion, ignoring a lot of the illegality that went on with the crackdowns. And sometimes, you had you had that incident out at Stanford, I want to say, with the paramilitary Israel responders. Just wild to me. I mean, this is a moment where if we did have any kind of vital free speech discourse in our country, Democrats would be able to come out and stand just on that and not have to worry about sort of implicating themselves in pro-Palestinian positioning and stuff like that. There is nothing for them. Like, they don't have that pretext to come out and stand up for us. And it's because people don't actually believe in free speech. I'm not really, I wouldn't count on being safe if you're in a blue state or if you have a Democratic governor or anything like that. It reminds me so much of the organizing I did during the War on Terror, where I was just constantly telling people, be careful who you give your names to, be careful what you write down in emails, be careful where you give your money to. Just because they are looking for excuses to derail this, and they aren't going to play fair. That's the thing. They aren't going to accept like very narrow legal arguments in your defense. They're just going to look for any kind of excuse to shut us down. And so you have to be ready for that.
Well, Carl, I mean, I don't want to get kind of bogged down in the history here, but I think that it is worth sort of like giving a little bit of that perspective for folks, and just tell me if you think that this timeline kind of works here. Is that one of the things is that you have in the Bush era this kind of crackdown on like civil liberties, free speech. I mean, literally we had those quote unquote like free speech zones. I think a lot of people, especially some of our younger audience, don't even know about that. Then you have the Obama years where you also start to see this crackdown on whistleblowers, right? You get Trump won. What's scary about it is that like we have these Bush examples and these Trump examples, but also I think there has just been almost like a kind of political consensus, specifically around like quote unquote like terror, national security, that hasn't really been pulled back in the past decades.
It's strange, during the Bush era, I think like liberals in particular were a bit more clear-sighted about this, where I remember like they were concerned about use of the word terror to refer to anything that I don't like. They were concerned about use of words like treason and traitor, and they would be saying stuff like protest isn't treason and stuff like that. And now I'm hearing people, like that's one of the favorite liberal burns on Trump is to call him a traitor or accuse him of treason. And, a lot of times it's just on grounds of him doing things that are bad, like for example, they'll accuse him of treason for trying to get mineral rights in Ukraine. For example, that's bad, but that's not treacherous. That's not, it doesn't fit. And they're bringing back this whole really dangerous discourse of terrorism, treason, and you start hearing words like material support. During the Bush administration, the phrase was aid and comfort to the enemy was the one they always used. And I guess I do think there is a conspicuous difference this time around where liberal Democrats do not seem to have the same political incentive to push back against it, or at least they're not doing it. Whereas they did, and that created a little bit of breathing room for protesters where you knew that if things got really bad, you could probably write your blue state senator on free speech grounds or something like that, and they might put in a good word for you. Now, I live in Virginia, I would not count, well, maybe Tim Kaine, I don't know, but not Mark Warner. Absolutely not Mark Warner speaking up for anyone about any of this. So I do feel like, the partisan train has really changed. I think that Obama sort of normalized this approach to the war on terror. Just not shutting down Guantanamo, continuing to use these terms terrorist and doing stuff like maintaining drone warfare outside of legal norms. And he was able to do that because he called them terrorists. So he really sort of helped maintain a separate legal dispensation for so-called enemies of the state.
I will just update. So far, Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries still haven't tweeted since their photo op at the Edmund Pettus Bridge yesterday.
It was somebody. I just can't remember who.
Well, the most surprising, I think, is Senate Judiciary Twitter account, which is run by Dick Durbin, tweeted out free Mahmoud Khalil, which is nice. Let's do something about it now.
Okay, that might be the one I'm remembering.
Yeah, let's move on though to early on after Russia had invaded Ukraine, we had you on because you're one person on the left who got that call right. I'm curious. You have a recent piece here. Can Ukraine's U.S. allies catch up with Ukrainians? I'll just flash this on screen here. What's your argument in this piece, Carl?
Well, so it's actually very simple, which is at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of, as happens during wars, there was a lot of support for sort of maintaining a hard line. We want our borders back to where they were in 1991 or 1992. We want Crimea back. We want Donetsk and Luhansk back, and so on. And this was the majoritarian position. Whether you like it or not, this was the majoritarian position. And so when people, especially I would say hawks online are sort of the most, they're a different breed than even like Democrats on the Hill and stuff like that. There are these online hawks who they believe with all their hearts they're speaking for Ukrainians, but they have not updated their understanding of what Ukrainians actually want. And that's very important to them. So, today, as you can see on the graph that you showed, the main thing to understand about it is that you have these high yellow bars early on representing sort of let's take a hard line and not give up any land or anything for negotiations in the war. Now that big yellow line has dropped down to just 11% last month. 11% of the population is willing to maintain a hard line. The rest of them, 81%, want to look for a compromise solution in negotiations involving other countries. And if you look deeper into the polling at other polls they've done, it becomes pretty clear what specifically they want. So they want what they call security guarantees, which are, they don't want Russia to just turn around and reinvade as soon as they stand down or anything like that. Obviously, that's going to imply some kind of military presence in Ukraine. I don't like that, but I do not see any other way that this war ends. They want a military presence, and they're not going to feel safe without it. There have been some interesting proposals put on the table. Like one was a presence involving China and Brazil, for example. So I think that it would be a good idea to think outside of the box in terms of who is going to be stationed there. Russia has said that, NATO nations in the security force is a non-starter. And who knows if that's just a negotiating position or whether that's actually where they're going to draw the line and refuse to make a deal. But I think that really just getting like the UN involved, getting a UN peacekeeping force, that would be one way to deal with it. That's the way that they dealt with it in Georgia, for example. So that's the main thing that they want as a security force. As for territory, which is the big question everybody talks about, don't kill the messenger on this, but Ukrainians say that they are ready to, they do not want to fight for Crimea or the East. Overwhelming majority of them say that they're willing to put that on the table. Less of them are willing to put sort of the southern area that completes the land bridge to Crimea. Fewer of them, understandably, want to put that on the table, but still a majority last I checked. So the land stuff isn't a sticking point for them so much as some kind of security guarantees. And again, this makes sense to me. The East, I think it's kind of a foregone conclusion that the East and Crimea ends up with Russia. It's a majority position in those regions. They want to be with Russia, which is very different from the South, where they're still, when they do polling and stuff like that, people still want Ukraine to win. They still want them with Ukraine. So I think that, honestly, the best outcome at this point would involve Europe taking the lead, getting Trump out of this as much as possible, because Trump is just going to try to loot as much as possible. These mineral deals are outrageous. Let Europe take the lead and hope that they get the UN involved in security. And whatever negotiations take place. But I don't think, the bottom line is, I don't think that it's Americans' place to prejudge the negotiations at this point and say, no, we aren't even going to sit down until all of Russians have left the country. That's not even what Ukrainians are asking for at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's been depressing to see some of the, because like you mentioned in the piece, there's no recognition of that sort of how Ukrainians feel about this stuff.
I don't know that it's very well known. Part of the problem is, like, a lot of the polls that I get are on sites that aren't even in English. And I think that people don't know who to trust necessarily. So, like, for example, this poll here that we looked at, this isn't by like some Russian propaganda agency or something. This group is funded by USAID. So you would expect, if anything, them to take the opposite position if they were being manipulative, but they aren't. And you look at like the stuff that, say, NDI, National Democratic Institute, which is another, very sort of tied up with USAID and the Atlantic Council and all those groups. But when they do a lot of polls, and every single poll coming out of Ukraine says the same thing, which is that support for a hard line has collapsed. It's been collapsing since like 2023. And it's, people don't like, conscription is wildly unpopular. I think that if anything hurts Zelensky, that really could end up being his Achilles heel at the end. And there's some, wild video coming out from people resisting conscription. I wouldn't be quick to reject that as Russian propaganda, because I've been hearing, like, my sources in Ukraine have been talking about this for a long time. I know people who have been conscripted and whose families have been conscripted. I know people who've been hiding from conscription. So it's a really, really terrible situation, and it's just outrageous to me to think of these Americans sitting safely in the U.S. saying that people who do not want to fight anymore actually do want to fight, and please keep this war going on their behalf.
I mean,
and sorry, David, go ahead.
No, I'm just like, take this where you will, but like, I'm sorry. The fact of the matter is just like, most of these people aren't, and this is going to, fuel plenty of angry comments on this video, but they're not thinking about this very deeply. They're asking themselves one question only, which is it right that Putin invaded Ukraine and Russia's taking territory? And they say that's wrong. Therefore, anything, and then that's where they stop kind of considering what's actually happening on the ground, what it means for Ukrainians.
Yeah. I mean, this has been morally grueling for me. Just watching it happen and sort of trying to thread the needle and getting like sort of the right moral stance here, because there's so much going on when you both oppose Russia's invasion, also sort of understanding some of the things that led to it, but nevertheless opposing the invasion. And at the same time, understanding that this is not a war that Ukraine has ever had any chance of winning. And that, too, is largely our fault. We never intended to give them the support that they would need to win. If we did, this would be a radically different war. This wouldn't just be, it wouldn't just be a matter of sending over slightly more munitions or anything like that. I assume that we would have boots on the ground if we were actually trying to win this. We would be doing so much different. And so I've never taken seriously the idea that we were in it to win it. And once you realize that we aren't actually trying to win, the question just becomes, okay, then what are we doing there? Are we even making matters better? Are we just making it worse? And I think all we've done is draw it out and made it worse.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we had Lily Lynch on, I said something like, we are selling them something that we can't actually provide. Like, who told them that we were going to be able to win this war for them based on our track record? And in the back of my mind, I'm worried, like, well, what if there's a breakthrough and they retake a whole bunch of land or something like that? And then I'm on record for saying this. But at this point, it's clear there's no hope. And it was probably clear even then, and based on just my vague looks at the online intelligence or whatever. And it's just like nobody none of those people that are like avoiding conscription can even sell themselves the belief that they're actually going to liberate their country. They're going into a meat grinder.
Yeah, and I will say here I was on Hassan's show a while back, and this was the most controversial thing I said there, so I'll say it again here. Which is, if you are living, say, like out in the farmland of East Ukraine, like out near Donetsk or something outside the city, and your contact with the government is limited to paying bills and paying taxes, and then maybe every once in a while you have a police presence come by. The fact of the matter is, it's not going to change your life very much whether there is a Russian flag flying over City Hall in town or Ukrainian flag. Now, it will in other places. Like there are, for example, in cities, God knows what Russian troops would be doing. But there are a lot of places in Ukraine where they it's not even like sympathy towards Russia. They just don't really care like whose flag is flying in the distance. All they want to do is get back to farming and not get killed. And you have to take those people into account as well. You have to bear in mind that there are a lot of people who don't really have a lot to win in this war. Regardless of what happens, they have everything to lose and nothing to win.
Right. Yeah. Carl Beijer, people can follow you on Blue Sky because you've been censored off of Twitter. Is that right?
Yeah. It was what I was saying was too outrageous for Twitter. They couldn't handle me anymore. So I'm on Blue Sky a bit, not that often. It's a very different site, but if you want to follow me, that's the place to do it.
There you go, and we'll link to your blog, Substack, for everyone to follow it. Carl, thanks so much for talking through this stuff with us.
Yeah, happy to talk to y'all.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always, my good friend and comrade, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, and I'm really excited for today. Very, very Left Reckoning episode, something that we should have done a long time ago, but I'm very happy we're doing it today. We're talking with Tarence Ray of the Trillbillies. We'll be talking about Red State America and his excellent piece in The Nation, How America Invented the Red State. But really happy to be doing this. And Tarence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Phyllis.
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in your piece and definitely some kind of recent history maybe we could go through. But I want to start with the thing that kind of shocked me the most in your piece that I didn't know about. Could you explain the color map of American politics? Because I didn't realize how recent this red and blue thing was.
Yeah, it used to be flipped, like the color codes of Republican red and Democrat blue used to be reversed. In the 1970s, I think it was the Carter election in 1976 was the first election that they tried to do this color-coded scheme of red and blue. But they've always done, so like, the Electoral College is a very confusing and complex thing for a lot of Americans. And so to relay election results, they've always had to find out a way to make it discernible for a lot of people. Like as the 20th century media progressed and you had more competitive attempts to make this very Byzantine complex process more discernible to the everyday layman, they tried to make it as simple as possible. So that's when they landed on the red and blue of the late 70s. And that first attempt, actually, they built like a massive, I don't know, it was like 30 feet tall or something like that, like light bulb stricken map that I think almost burned down the studios at the time. I think that was NBC. And then of course it flipped in the 2000 election. And I did a lot of research on this for writing this piece. I was trying to figure out why did they decide on red and blue? And there was no really consensus on this. But it seems that the consensus is that the reason it stuck was precisely because the 2000 election results were contested. And so you had this 6-week recount process where the, Republican red, Democrat blue color code got kind of burned into everyone's mind as they were recounting the Florida votes in 2000. So yeah, no, it's a weird story as to how do we even tell the story of American politics to people? It's very complex.
It's always been disorientating for David and I because we're both from states that are coded as red now. That when we were born were blue. I'm from North Dakota. Dave's from Texas, where they had a long stand. And actually, my mom's from a dairy farm. I remember going to the farm and talking politics, and my city boy dad said he was voting for Bush in 2000 and got an earful from all of the farmers in eastern North Dakota. And now I think that sort of idea would blow people's minds.
Yeah.
Now.
It blew Thomas Frank's mind. He's a character in the story that I wrote. I disagree with him on a lot of stuff. That book, What's the Matter with Kansas, is both very enlightening and I think very kind of astute. It's funny. He's a good kind of comedic writer, but it's also kind of maddening because I think he frames up the question I mean, that's kind of where my entire piece started. Like the question of why do people in these states vote against their interests is something that it's always kind of hit me the wrong way, not because it's incorrect I mean, I guess it is incorrect. I guess the framing assumes something. The question already assumes something up front, which is that voting for the Democrats would be in their interest. And it's just, the Democrats haven't proven that in the last 30 years that would be the case. And I guess that's kind of why it's not really set well. But if you go to...
I think that, yeah.
I was gonna say, David, if you go to like West Texas, there's like towns called like New Deal. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of there's like in Kansas and that kind of stuff. Like from that sort of farmer labor alliance of the early 20th century, you see that kind of residual effect of that. Sorry to cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off at all. I mean, I was like, undoubtedly, like there's a great history. And I mean, this is like, Thomas's Frank's work, right? It's sort of like, Kansas was like such a center of the populist movement, though I'd argue, Texas is pretty high up there, frankly. But the assumption that you're getting at here is that like, oh yeah, voting Democrat is sort of like in their interest. I think is a way that I think leftists, like when they deal with quote unquote red states or rural America, more generally, I think they kind of mistake why people do the things that they do, and they don't recognize it. Like, no, they do have interests, and sometimes those interests are different than yours. I mean, this is something that we've talked about with Keith Orell about like the kind of history of rural America and capitalism in rural America and how that relates to the Republican Party and the specific pitch that Republicans made. There's a great book called The Rural Voter that just came out recently. And, despite the kind of portrayal of rural America just sort of raging and being super angry about everything, like people are pretty mad, and they're pretty mad about this thing called NAFTA, which everybody always ignores as a major betrayal of a traditional base, frankly, in a lot of states for the Democratic Party. So, I mean, if there's anything there that you want to pick up on, I'm happy to hear it. But I'm also like, I'm curious what you think about this like rural red state combination that goes on, right? Because these are two different things. When we talk about a red state, I mean, Texas is like for example, like Texas is one of the most urban states in the country, right? Yeah. And yet, we are a red state. Right? There is this kind of like slippage in the way that we talk about red state and rural America when we might be, meaning one or the other, right?
For sure. I think that's partially what I was trying to understand in my piece, which is that, like, I find the entire construction of red states versus blue states sort of perplexing. And furthermore, the conflation with rural America that you're pointing out, simply because every state has rural areas. I mean, I guess maybe like New Jersey. New Jersey has rural. I've driven through New Jersey, though. There's even Pine Barrens, they've got rural areas there, too.
I have a Mennonite friend from New Jersey.
There you go. I mean, it's like a diverse, we've got a diverse sort of template to kind of work from. But I guess I'm trying to understand like how this moniker, really how this like paradigm got to be constructed in the first place. And what I find really fascinating is that, like we were just talking about at the top of the program, it began after the 2000 election. And I've kind of just like, this is not an original observation by any means. We're all well familiar with it. But it really is fascinating that every election now, pretty much since then, it's a foregone conclusion that these states are unwinnable. And by the Democrats. I'm sorry, I should specify. They just automatically write those states off. And I'm not here to say that, like, oh, they are winnable, like you could win them back. I don't even know if that's true. I kind of think, I've lived in Kentucky for over about 13 years now, and I don't really think that anything the Democrats could do would be really able to rehabilitate their brand. However, at the same time, I do think that the left, if it's serious about, making it a political intervention in national politics, has to try to understand how power is reproduced in rural America and what's going on there. And because, a lot of people live there. But as I've tried to point out over the course of my writing career and podcasting career, that's where raw materials come from. Like that's where food comes from. That's where coal and natural gas come from. That's where the land, these prized massive plots of land for farming or ranching are. And And you're starting to see this now, how it's starting to enter the sort of cultural lexicon of American politics, not just through the Republican Party, but through like these cultural products like Yellowstone, the Taylor Sheridan shows. You know what I'm saying? So I think that the left, it's obvious to me that the liberals aren't really interested anymore, but the left is going to have to try to figure out, come up with a political economy of it that's resonant with people and speaks to their experiences.
Yeah, I wanted to, it seems like the structural forces always get underplayed, and I like the section you had on the sort of anthropological pathologizing of folks, both by the right, the Charles Murray types, J.D. Vance, and it's the flip side, other side of the coin by the liberals with the whole dying of whiteness sort of stuff. I'm curious which side of that you want to speak to.
Yeah, so this is something that, like, I was trying to understand. I came up with this formulation because I was trying to understand, like, what do we make of Tim Walz? Of all the people in the 2020 election, I think he was kind of the most fascinating, but he's also the one that was sort of sidelined more than anyone. And so I was trying to understand, like, what was that about? It's weird that, like, the first 2 weeks, everyone was really excited, like, oh, they might be trying to do something different, break from the norm, etc. And then they started campaigning with the Cheneys, and you didn't really hear from Tim Walz at all after that. So I was like trying to understand how liberals have tried to understand rural America since 2020. And really where this all began was with a book that I received in the mail last year. Someone asked me to review it. It was called White Rural Rage. Have you all heard of this book? I can't remember the writer's name.
Yeah, we've covered it.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah, and so I was...
Jonathan Metzl.
Right. Or Metzl is dying of whiteness. Right? White Rural Rage is... These two guys, they're like MSNBC
Paul
guys.
Waldman and Thomas Schaller.
There we go.
Waldman and Schaller, yeah.
Waldman and Schaller. As I was like reading their book, I was like, how do you get something like this? Like, what is... And just for the audience, like a brief overview of that book is basically that we have a growing constitutional and political crisis in this country, best represented by the provincial rubes in the backwater areas, in the rural areas, and that they are a existential threat to America. And the argument was, like, to me, it was pretty shocking, but at the same time, it was not really out of the blue. It feels like liberals have been kind of circling this for a while. But I was like trying to understand, like, how do you get this book in 2024? The same year you also get Tim Walz. You've got these weird, like, steps forward, these steps back. So I was like trying to go through the entire historiography of how liberals have tried to understand rural America since 2000. It really did start with Thomas Frank. It started with what's the matter with Kansas? And we mentioned it already, but his premise was, like, how do you start off with a state like Kansas that had this long storied populist farmer labor alliance history going back to the New Deal? Fast forward 80 years and they vote for George W. Bush in huge margins. And I had Frank and Beijer, Joe Beijer, who wrote this book called Deer Hunting for Jesus. That, like, I see them as kind of like populist writers, right? Like, they were kind of on the ground. Their lives were kind of embedded in the lives of their subjects. They were genuinely, in my opinion, interested in how to come up with a better form of liberalism that would cater to the rural subject. But then I think after the 2008 recession, after the election of Obama, and after the rise of the Tea Party, is when you get a new mode of analysis on rural America. And I call that, like, anthropology. You get a lot of these anthropological writers who are kind of interested. They're not so much interested in how to reform the Democratic Party to make these people's lives better. They're more interested in the kind of psychological interiority of these people. And it's really kind of stunning, the degree to which they employ a lot of these same psychological metrics and empiricism that you would kind of see in the 1960s when people studying, like, poverty in places like Appalachia. And these books are all really, they're kind of amusing. They're kind of, they're really tone deaf, but they're kind of like Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild is a kind of, like, paradigmatic example of this. And there's this guy named Robert Wuthnow. I think he's a professor at Princeton. He's written a lot of books in this vein too. And I think that, like, these writers kind of seeded the ground for J.D. Vance, really. Like, by the time J.D. Vance came along, there had been this anthropological mode of inquiry into rural America that J.D. Vance was able to really plug into. And that's why liberals loved his book. I mean, they made that book what it was. But then, to fast forward a few more years, by the time you get to 2024, you've got a distinct kind of fatalism. And that's best represented by that White Rural Rage book. And I think that you saw that entire process play out in about 6 weeks in the 2024 election, where they started off with this populist, like Tim Walz thing. Then they went into this kind of like self-inquiry, like, oh, well, do we really understand rural America? And by the end, it had become this fatalistic project where they were like, we don't want Tim Walz anywhere near this. And they'd kind of sidelined them. So I think, that's a really long answer, but like that's kind of this process. And if I was to guess, I'd say we're probably going to see a similar process start all over.
It's fascinating the way the camo merch sort of was the last sort of remnant of Walzian influence. And that was sort of adopted by, I think I'd say like younger folks who maybe were more ambivalent about the ticket in general, but there's at least that camo that maybe nods toward another idea.
I just want to piggyback on that and hear your opinion, Terence, because I'm curious in your part of the world, like here, like, I'm in Austin and like, there's been this whole kind of like cowboy couture thing going on, right? As like more and more new folks move here and, they start dressing up and acting a certain way. And I'm curious if y'all are having a similar thing, in Kentucky. I feel like in certain cities, like they also, I see at least on Instagram, that I'll get kind of ads for certain brands and stuff out of there. But I'm curious if that's the case there. And I'm curious, like, about how you think that does relate to that kind of camo Walz Harris cap, because there's part of me that's like, I think they should embrace some kind of imagery that they've been sort of afraid to touch. But there was something about that one that, it didn't.
Yeah, I think that, yes, that's definitely happened in Kentucky. With Kentucky, it's kind of more along the lines of, it's kind of coming out of like the 1990s, early 2000s fascination with the South. So it's more in like bourbon and horses and stuff. I think what you're describing, David, is more of a kind of fetishization of the West and of cowboy culture. And genuinely, Thomas Frank had an op-ed right after the election, after the 2024 election, where he was basically talking about, like, I think the opening line is like, when did you realize that the Democrats were doomed? My moment was when I was in a museum and I saw something about settler colonialism. And it kind of like clicked for me. I was like, everybody wants to reclaim some sort of Americana or some sort of like bygone era of when you could, feasibly be sort of naive about the conquest of North America, because that kind of united us all. That was like our kind of uniting national spirit, and it allowed for, in some ways, these kind of alliances between labor and farmers and everything else. But like, I'm kind of at the point now where like Thomas Frank asks, like, what's the matter with Kansas? It's kind of like, I think it's the settler colonialism. I think that like this whole process of fetishization of the land, of our rugged individualism, of our, Protestant work ethic, all of this has created something that we would all like to try to recapture as best embodied in that camo hat. But none of us can really get it. It's always going that specific thing is always going to redound to the right, because that is a reactionary historical process. Like it's not something that the left in any way can really reclaim or engage in. And even furthermore, I've pointed this out before, but like there's also nothing inherently working class about camo. I mean, I know rich guys that fucking wear camo and go shoot, bucks and stuff. Like there's nothing inherently working class about a cowboy hat. Like these are all like symbols. So yeah, go ahead.
No. In fact, Terence, I just have to add. And look, I'm like all in this kind of stuff. I have a good collection of Stetsons and things like that. But Stetsons traditionally were like the boss. Like the boss. Yeah. You might aspire to have one, right? You might aspire, and then maybe you got one. Right. But like it was never this kind of thing that like only like, the people on the bottom end of the tone pole were getting it. No, this was always a kind of elite. Anyway, no, I think that is a good point as well, which is, I think this is the thing that is kind of odd. And I'm curious what your thoughts on this about, the separation of like the American media and the political class. And I know a lot of conversations about this kind of like literal geographical divide that just like almost, I lived in New York City for a while and I lived near Matt. And I was in this kind of Facebook group for like my block, and I realized, oh my Lord, almost everybody who works at like the Atlantic and the New York Times is like renting a little area, right? Like there is a concentration of folks, and that means that like there is like a lack of connection. So I'm curious, what role or what your thoughts are on that aspect about like, the way that rural or red state America is sort of talked about or written about, because there is such a hyper concentration of, the media in certain parts of the country.
Well, I think that something that I pointed out in the piece, in which I think very much contributed to what I call like the kind of fatalistic strain of inquiry about rural America, is this line you see a lot from recently departed New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, which is that the red states basically mooch off of the blue states, that like the blue states subsidize the red states. There is a truth to that in the sense that like, okay, right now they're talking about cutting Medicaid. If they cut Medicaid, a lot of red states are going to suffer because they don't have the surplus, they don't have the tax base really to make up for that loss. So they do, the federal government does keep a lot of these red states afloat. But like formulating it in this welfare queen type language, this, you know what I'm saying? That is not, it's not helpful, first of all, but it's also not really true. And this kind of gets into my problem with asking about voting against their own interests and even using voting as a metric for what a person thinks or what they feel or how they want the country to go or whatever. I think that a lot of people here in Kentucky, they're not actively going out there and voting for, we want New York's money. Like, I don't even know how people vote. I don't know what the calculus is in their minds or whatever. I think voting is something that is almost sort of, it's like a occluded alchemy or something. It's like not really anything I can ever understand. But if you're actually trying to understand rural America and the people that live there, you have to understand, you have to look at the political economy of the place. And by that, I mean, you have to look at two things: a person's relationship to the means of production and their relationship to land. I think that those two things would give you a pretty good explanation of what's going on in a community, how power is reproduced, how people think that they have autonomy over their lives and can control their futures. And then you can get into some inquiries about like, well, who would they support? Who would they not? There's a really good book by this sociologist named Jennifer Silva named We're Still Here that I think does a really good job of surveying a lot of people in these Rust Belt areas, these rural areas, and trying to get into like the nitty-gritty detail of what they believe and why they believe it. And I think that does a good job of mixing political economy with that. But for the most part, it's people like, Hochschild and Robert Wethnow or whatever going into a community and using a kind of like pre-formulated set of parameters and framework to basically impose their own sort of understanding on, and not on really how the community works, but on how the people there think. Because that's really what we're kind of like talking about at the end of the day. Like they really want to know, because that's kind of the way that like liberal virtue politics work. Like a person can only get, like means tested. Like the person can only receive benefits if they believe the right thing. So he's like, all of that stuff that's not scientific, first of all. It's not Marxist. It kind of gets into like a populist vein, but like you really have to look at the material circumstances. Like rural people aren't sacred. They're not more authentic. They're not any of these things. They're just people caught in a social nexus, and you have to understand that, I guess.
I just want to make another plug for people to read The Rural Voter, because it's a really interesting piece, because in it, they basically take mass opinion polls across the country in rural and urban America. And one thing that's kind of interesting is, despite the kind of narrative that like hard right positions like on guns and abortion even are actually the most concentrated, the strongest in rural America versus urban America, is not true. And just a quick like explainer of that, like when you think of the megachurch, which is what everyone talks about when they talk about red, that's in Houston. Right, those are in like the cities. Yeah. They're not. In fact, like across America, churches are closing down. Right.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. Like people sometimes also think statistically have a hard time considering these kind of problems, because even in a quote unquote red state, these aren't states that are 20% Democrat and 80% Republican too. Like these are like There are states that are going to be harder to win because 10 points is a lot to win. But that's a lot of people when you're saying 40% of the population, is voting one way.
Well, and I think that something that I've tried to also show through writing, especially in Eastern Kentucky, is that a lot of political economy gets meted out through regional power blocks. And by that, I mean, if you were to go, there is this thing called One East Kentucky. It's like a industrial park company in Eastern Kentucky. And if you go to their website, like on the, these big, they've got these pie charts, these numbers and everything. They're advertising to developers and to capitalists. It's like Eastern Kentucky is 95% union free. They are hardworking people. It gets into all these pathological things about their nature, their Scots-Irish heritage. They work hard. They are dedicated to work, but they're not union. And so you want to relocate your business here, right? Because you can make more money if you do that. Well, I mean, it's not really true because Eastern Kentucky is way out of the way. At this point, if you're trying to make more money, you'd be better off relocating to somewhere like in Ohio or, something like that. But the way that, in my opinion, these politics work out and how power is reproduced is through these kind of like regionally circumscribed like identity markers. And that opens up a whole other, realm of discussion. But I think that my point here is that if you're looking into like how a person's ideology is formulated and framed and how they engage with politics, you also have to look at how their community leaders and business leaders sell their region to capitalists in other parts of the country. Because that has knock-on effects at the local level in terms of like their school board makeup, the ideological, content of their fucking textbooks. These, like this is like microscopic stuff at a certain point. But I guess my point is just that like this differs really from place to place. It's not going to be the same in Eastern Kentucky that it is in like rural Wisconsin or something. And part of the reason it is that way in Eastern Kentucky is because Eastern Kentucky used to have a huge union history. The entire healthcare system was built up literally through the UMWA, the mine workers union. And as those jobs were just rolled away and rolled back and destroyed, the union was as well. And so now, local business leaders are basically begging with capitalists to relocate their Bitcoin mines to Eastern Kentucky or their widget factories or whatever on the basis that like, look, we're not in unions anymore. We're still hardworking, but we're not like, we're not organized and solidaristic anymore. We only care about ourselves. And again, that's not even true either. So it's a lot of powerful people trying to formulate what a person thinks. Some of them are well-meaning libs. Some of them are not well-meaning. Some of them are, powerful conservatives in extractive industries and real estate. But it's something that like, I think that leftists are going to have to like start looking at in more fine detail. It took, be back against that.
Well, I mean, I think that, people on the left in general are just going to have to get more serious about figuring out how to win people to our program anywhere, right? Which is sort of like, I think just the general point that sometimes folks tend to mystify people in this country. But Terence, I mean, I would love to, to keep going. People should read the piece, How America Invented the Red State. But I do want to talk about one last thing before we let you go, which is sort of talking about mystification. I think, all three of us probably share the same kind of like belief in like, the radical potential of like working class people, like in our, in our home areas and, what's possible. And also all of us, I think, are very interested in the history and sort of like correcting the narrative a little bit. But I had to ask you about, there was a few years ago, it's less so now, but it was really popular, these kind of like Southern fried memes. And don't get me wrong, some of them were fun, but they were basically, for people who are unfamiliar, it was basically this idea that like out in the country, there's just like this radical proletariat that is they're just actually waiting for like their most radical communist party. The reason that they're not engaged in politics is because everyone's too reformist. I mean, Terence, could you help us sort of find a middle road between like maybe that and the kind of pessimistic view that liberals have of like red America?
Yeah, I think that if there's any main consistency, anything that I've stuck with since we started doing our show in 2017, tried to write about over the years, is that most of these people are just apolitical. They are ground down by a set of material forces that I mean, I can't even. If you were to go to Eastern Kentucky, what a person is facing, just a regular person is facing on a day-to-day basis, their survival strategies have been heavily criminalized. That involves, like, they've been pushed out of the formal workforce, first of all. And that means they've had to rely on the informal economy, selling copper, doing, just landscaping work for cash, selling drugs. A lot of these things have been heavily criminalized. So if they can't get a job in the formal economy, which they likely can't, they have to resort to the informal economy, which is heavily militarized and surveilled and watched over by a massive police state in a lot of these rural areas. The New York Times did a huge story about this last year about, like, I think per capita, the number of police shootings is actually higher in rural America. If it's not higher, it's an insane number that you wouldn't even think. Like, the way, the degree to which people in rural areas are policed and surveilled by police officers is in some ways even more repressive, because a lot of the times the police officer. You know what I'm saying? Like, their family. They know your family. They can keep a tighter reign of control over your life. So, like, their interaction with the police state, with the rehabilitation industrial complex, all of these things, on top of trying to just make ends meet with living paycheck to paycheck, raising rent, increasing natural disasters. Eastern Kentucky has gone through 2 1,000-year floods in the last 2-3 years. When do these people have any time for organizing in any kind of meaningful way? The best they can do is they see what's on TV, and honestly, there was a miners' blockade where a bunch of coal miners blockaded I don't know if you'll remember this, like in 2019, they blockaded a coal train. And I went down to that, I spent the entire time with them down at that blockade. The 2 politicians I heard them talk the most shit about was AOC and Mitch McConnell. So it's like that kind of just like they're just kind of like every other person. You know what I'm saying? Like they have some beliefs here, they have some beliefs there. But until somebody is actually able to harness their anger and point it towards something that, like, has an actual shot at making their lives better, then yeah, I mean, they're pretty much apolitical. You know what I'm saying? They're not swamp Maoists ready to start shooting landlords or anything like that. But
not yet.
I do think there's potential for radicalism there, precisely because their life circumstances they're very radical. So,
no, I mean, I think it's more that, like, there's a lot of potential, and we just have to be serious about it. And again, those are meant in jest, but I do think sometimes we got a little ahead of ourselves with some of that stuff, I think, for a moment.
The Dale Earnhardt memes were fun. They were fun for a while, but yeah. Dale Earnhardt was probably a liberal, if I had to guess. Sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, that's the thing that's funny about it, is, like, more often than not, like, what you actually probably are going to get is more middle liberalism from that kind of thing. But Terence, really, it was so wonderful being able to speak with you. Folks should be listening to the Trillbillies. We'll have a link, obviously, to both that and to this excellent piece in The Nation. Anything else people should be on looking out for?
I write every now and then for The Nation. I also write for The Baffler. So definitely go check out my writing there at The Baffler, because there's some good stuff there too.
Well, thank you very much, Terence.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a blast.
All right, that was a lot of fun. It was really great having him on the program. People
put me in a whole nother good mood listening to it back.
Yeah. Well, for people who don't, like, I guess, a little behind the scenes fact for you, we could not see him at all in the original.
Oh, yeah.
He was, like, completely pixelated. So, watching it back again was kind of nice.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, folks, we're going to go over the post game patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get access. We'll be taking your questions. We got some funny and interesting stuff from the state of Texas that you're not going to want to miss, including an investigation into this very, very strange lady. This is from her run in Missouri, and unfortunately, she already has a Texas connection, but we'll get into that in the post game.
This is what I will do to the growing books when I become Secretary of State.
Let's go. Welcome to the main event.
Super
for audio. For audio listeners, she said the grooming books. The
Yes.
grooming books. I'll just say that, like, the grooming books is a concept, in case, you know, that's not it's not on your radar. Not really something I think about a lot, is like all of the things that make kids accepting of gay lifestyles. And I think it's probably just okay to have just like books about, you know, straight fat like characters. Good to have in libraries. Not really policing it.
Matt, it's going to get worse than that, unfortunately. So you're not going to want to miss it. Patreon.com/LeftRight to get access, plus all of our excellent bonus content, including our Sunday shows. And we had a juicy one last Sunday. Yes, we spoke with Owen Higgins, who wrote a very interesting book about Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, and the entire, just the kind of right-wing media funding empire that's been influencing our politics.
So I was looking for the exit thing, but
yeah,
yeah,
no worries.
Owen, I think like some info, I think it might be in the book, but I hadn't heard it before, or at least didn't strike out to me in reading that it was Sachs, David Sachs,
Yeah.
that set up the meeting with Taibbi and Elon. And I mean, I remember about 2 years ago seeing Elon show up in Taibbi's replies about certain things, and kind of doing crying, laughing emojis at him. Like, this doesn't look good. I didn't know that it would end up being the Twitter files, but yeah, great talking with Owen.
Yeah, so get that patreon.com/LeftRight and get access and all of the bonus content. We'll be up in the post game, patreon.com/LeftRight and get access to that in just a couple minutes. So come hang out with us. Have a great rest of your night, friends.